In 1757, one man made a decision that would condemn 300 million people to nearly 200 years of colonial rule. His name was Mir Jafar. He was a general in the army of Bengal, one of the richest regions on earth at the time. And he made a deal with the British East India Company that would change the course of history. The British didn't conquer India through military superiority. They had a tiny army compared to Indian kingdoms. They conquered India through betrayal, through finding ambitious men willing to sell out their own people for personal power and wealth. And Mir Jafar was the first and most consequential of these collaborators. His greed opened the door, and once that door opened, the British walked through and took everything. An entire subcontinent, trillions in wealth extracted, tens of millions dead from famines, 2 centuries of subjugation. This is the story of how one man's ambition and betrayal enabled the British Empire's conquest of India, and why understanding collaboration and greed is essential to understanding how empires actually work. To understand what Mir Jafar destroyed, you need to understand what Bengal was in the early 1700s. Bengal, modern-day Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal, was the manufacturing hub of the world. It produced fine textiles, especially muslin and silk, that were traded across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Bengali cloth was legendary for its quality. Bengal's economy was larger than Britain's. Estimates suggest Bengal accounted for roughly 12% of global GDP in the early 18th century. For comparison, Britain was maybe 2–3%. Bengal alone was wealthier than entire European countries. The region was ruled by the Nawab of Bengal, a governor under the declining Mughal Empire. By the 1750s, the Mughal Empire was fragmenting, and regional rulers like the Nawab had effective independence. The Nawab's treasury was overflowing, agriculture was productive, trade was booming. Cities like Dhaka and Murshidabad were centers of commerce and culture. Into this world came the British East India Company. The East India Company wasn't a government, it was a corporation, a trading company chartered by the British Crown to conduct business in Asia. They'd been operating in India since the 1600s, setting up trading posts in places like Calcutta, Madras, Chennai, and Bombay, Mumbai. They made money buying Indian goods, textiles, spices, indigo, and selling them in Europe at huge markups. It was extraordinarily profitable. But they wanted more. They wanted to control production, control trade routes, and eliminate local rulers who could tax them or restrict their operations. The problem: they didn't have the military power to conquer Bengal. The Nawab's army vastly outnumbered them. So they found another way: betrayal. In 1757, the Nawab of Bengal was Siraj-ud-Dowlah, a young ruler in his early 20s. He was suspicious of the British East India Company's growing power and their fortifications in Calcutta. Siraj-ud-Dowlah attacked Calcutta in June 1756. This was a direct challenge to British commercial interests. The East India Company couldn't accept losing their most important trading post. They sent Robert Clive, a company military officer, with reinforcements to retake Calcutta. Clive recaptured it in January 1757, but he knew he couldn't defeat Siraj-ud-Dowlah's full army in open battle. So Clive started looking for cracks in the Nawab's court, and he found one: Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar was the commander-in-chief of the Nawab's army, one of the most powerful men in Bengal, but he had ambition and grievances. He wanted to be Nawab himself, and he was willing to betray his ruler to get it. The British made Mir Jafar an offer: help us defeat Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and we'll make you the Nawab. You'll have the title, the power, the palace. All we want is favorable trading terms and some financial compensation. Mir Jafar agreed. Other Bengali elites joined the conspiracy, wealthy bankers and merchants who calculated that siding with the British would protect their commercial interests. They didn't see themselves as traitors. They saw it as a pragmatic political move in a time of instability. They were catastrophically wrong. On June 23, 1757, the British East India Company's army, about 3,000 men, faced Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army of 50,000 at the Battle of Plassey. On paper, the British should have been annihilated, but Mir Jafar, commanding a large portion of the Nawab's army, didn't fight. He stood aside. He'd ordered his troops not to engage. The battle was over in hours. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was defeated, captured, and executed. Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal, and with that single act of betrayal, the British East India Company became the real power in Bengal, the richest region in India. Mir Jafar thought he'd won. He was Nawab. He had the title, the palace, the formal authority. But he'd sold his actual power to the British. Immediately after Plassey, the British East India Company began extracting payments. They demanded massive financial compensation for their costs in the battle. They demanded trading monopolies. They demanded tax-free status for their goods. Mir Jafar had to pay. He emptied the treasury to satisfy British demands, and when the treasury ran out, he had to raise taxes on his own people to pay the British. Within a few years, Mir Jafar was a puppet. He held the title of Nawab, but every decision had to be approved by the British. When he tried to assert independence, the British simply threatened to replace him, which they did briefly, before reinstating him when it suited them. Plassey opened the floodgates. The British realized they didn't need to conquer India with vast armies from Britain. They could conquer it by finding local collaborators, ambitious nobles, disgruntled generals, merchant elites who calculated that working with the British was more profitable than resisting them. Over the next 100 years, the British used this playbook across India. Find internal divisions, Hindu versus Muslim, different kingdoms competing, elite versus commoners. Offer deals to ambitious individuals. We'll make you the ruler. We'll protect your wealth. We'll give you power as long as you serve our interests. Extract wealth systematically. Once a region was under British control, they restructured the economy to benefit Britain. Raw materials extracted, manufactured goods flooded Indian markets, destroying local industries. Taxes increased to fund British operations. Use local armies. The British Indian Army, which enforced British rule, was mostly Indian soldiers commanded by British officers. Indians were conquering India for the British. By 1857, a century after Plassey, the British East India Company controlled most of India, not through overwhelming military might from Britain, but through collaboration, division, and exploitation of local ambitions. And it all started with Mir Jafar's betrayal at Plassey. Let's talk about what this betrayal cost India economically. Before British rule, India accounted for approximately 23% of global GDP. It was one of the two largest economies in the world, along with China. By the time India gained independence in 1947, India was less than 4% of global GDP. 2 centuries of colonial rule had transformed one of the richest regions on Earth into one of the poorest. What happened? Deindustrialization. The British systematically destroyed Indian manufacturing. Bengali textiles, which had dominated global markets, were taxed and regulated out of existence. British factory-made cloth flooded Indian markets. Indian weavers went from exporters to unemployed. Resource extraction. Raw materials, cotton, indigo, tea, opium, were extracted from India, shipped to Britain, turned into manufactured goods, and sold back to India at huge markups. India became a captive market and resource colony. Famines. British economic policies caused or worsened massive famines. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed 10 million people, 1/3 of Bengal's population. The famines of the late 1800s killed millions more. Food was exported from India to Britain even as Indians starved, because maintaining export revenues and British profits was the priority. Economist Utsa Patnaik estimates that Britain extracted roughly $45 trillion in today's terms from India over 200 years. That's not just profit, that's wealth that should have stayed in India, been reinvested in Indian infrastructure, education, and development. Instead, it built British railways, British industries, British power. India was impoverished to enrich Britain. And this entire system of extraction began with Mir Jafar's decision in 1757. His betrayal opened the door. The British walked through and took everything. So what's the lesson here? Why does one man's betrayal in 1757 matter today? Because it reveals a fundamental truth about how empires operate. They don't conquer through pure military force. They conquer through collaboration with local elites who prioritize personal gain over collective welfare. The British didn't have the army to conquer 300 million people, but they didn't need to. They just needed to find enough ambitious Indians willing to collaborate. Generals like Mir Jafar, merchants who wanted British protection, nobles who wanted British backing against their rivals. This is the pattern throughout colonial history. Spain in the Americas, they conquered the Aztec and Inca empires with tiny armies by allying with indigenous groups who hated the dominant empires. France in Africa, French colonial rule depended on local chiefs and intermediaries who enforced French policies in exchange for power and wealth. Every empire uses this strategy: find divisions, exploit ambitions, offer deals to individuals who will betray their collective interest for personal gain. Mir Jafar is the archetype, the collaborator, the man who sold his country for a crown and ended up a puppet. He's remembered in South Asia as the ultimate traitor. Mir Jafar is still used as an insult, someone who betrays their people for personal benefit. But here's the uncomfortable truth. There were thousands of Mir Jafars. British rule lasted 200 years because enough Indians at every level chose collaboration over resistance. Not everyone, but enough. Some collaborated out of greed, some out of fear, some because they genuinely believed British rule would be more stable or prosperous, some because they calculated that their community or class would benefit. But the cumulative effect was catastrophic. India went from 23% of global GDP to 4%. Tens of millions died in famines. An entire civilization was restructured to serve foreign interests. And it all started with one general's decision in 1757. Mir Jafar betrayed the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. He thought he was securing power and wealth for himself. What he actually did was open the door for 200 years of British colonial rule. His greed enabled the conquest of an entire subcontinent, the extraction of trillions in wealth, the deaths of millions, the transformation of one of the richest regions on Earth into one of the poorest. One man's betrayal didn't cause all of this, but it started it. And it showed the British the playbook: find ambitious collaborators, exploit divisions, and conquer through betrayal rather than battle. If this changed how you understand how empires actually conquer, hit subscribe. We reveal the economic and human mechanisms behind historical power shifts. Drop a comment. Could India have resisted if internal betrayal hadn't opened the door? I'll see you in the next one.